Hi everyone, my name is Terence. I'm actually based in Singapore. Very happy to be here. And first of all, just let me express my gratitude and appreciation to the co-founder and CEO of Olahkarsa, Pak Unggul Ananta, right? And also, I'd like to also thank the Deputy Minister of Environment of Indonesia, Pak Dias Hendropiono, Deputy for Investment Planning, Ministry of Investment and Downstream Industry of Republic Indonesia, Pak Dedi Latif, Director of Environment, National Development Planning of Republic Indonesia, Pak Nizar Marizi, Deputy Chairman of the Green Industry, Kadin, Pak Halim Kala, sponsors, fellow speakers, and esteemed guests for being here with your presence today. Right, today I'm going to address the importance of why management of climate risk and opportunity is important. Right, and a lot of times in my work, actually, working with APAC companies, Middle East African companies, we often try to get a sense from companies we work with on what management of climate risk and opportunities mean to them, right? And what you're seeing on the screen right now is an encapsulation of the anecdotal feedback that we've gotten over time, right? So we've got things such as optimization of risk. We have things like branding and reputation, because some companies would also want to manage their risk, to be shown managing their risks and opportunities and disclosing them so that reputation of the company can improve. Right? I've also got things like value creation, operational efficiency, but one of the most common feedback that we always get is about compliance and disclosures. But the question is, can we do better than this, right? Compliance and disclosure. Right? A lot of times when we talk about management of climate risk and opportunities, the words on the screen today, they are not wrong, right? If we were to string them, piece them together, actually they form a greater storyline, they form a greater narrative, which is basically, identifying risks and opportunities and then integrating it into a overall business strategy, risk management, and then revising as we go along with the business growth, right? So in a nutshell, there's always a bit of linkage to the overall strategy of the company, climate strategy, overall business strategy. Let's take a look at, the percentage of companies, with evidence of integrating climate change into strategy today. Right? So based on S&P Global's ESG scoring mechanism, right? And of course, we have a whole sample of more than about 13,000 companies globally assigned with ESG scores. Right, globally, we see that we have about 57% of companies that have certain evidence of integrating climate strategy into their business. Right, and of course, on the APAC level, the number is slightly higher, about 61%. And then we slowly zoom into Southeast Asia, not too bad, 58%. And then we've also got some statistics for Indonesia as a market specifically, right, where I think the sample size is pretty small, 132 for now, showing a 38.6% rate where companies have evidence of integrating climate change strategy. Sorry. Yes. So when we talk about strategy as a whole, when we talk about the whole sustainability journey from the starting of data collection, the identification of risk levers, to the entire end where you, as a business, you develop a strategy and go on continuing enhancing your strategy on the go. I think there are certain very important relationships on a company's journey that is not to be neglected, right? And I think when we speak to clients a lot of time, when we speak to companies a lot of times, we find that some parts of these relationships tend to be forgotten or neglected at some point. Right, I've kind of divided them into pairs, right? So that is to mean that the absence of one part of the pair would be suboptimal, would be not ideal, right? That means you have a room to improve in your journey, right? Starting from the left top, right, we have operations versus supply chain and value chain, right? What this means is that, sustainability is not just about you as a business doing your own effort. It's about also looking after what comes to you in your supply chain as well as your value chain, right? So supply chain and value chain is not to be forgotten. Sustainability and risk management. We've come across companies where they act on sustainability as a silo. I think a lot of times because of disclosure, they just do for the sake of doing. But of course, a lot of times they also forget that in the sustainability risk actually ultimately translates to your traditional categories of risk, and ultimately is eligible to be integrated into the overall enterprise risk management framework, and find solutions, strategize from there on, right? So again, sustainability and risk management is very much interlinked. Disclosures versus implementation, again, linked to the previous point, a lot of companies are, especially in the early days, where we don't see a lot of strong governance structures being set up, where a lot of times they are just rushing through the disclosure process. Implementation part tends to be forgotten. They disclose, they can set target, and they tell people they set target, but they forget to start implementing work towards the target, right? Missing the implementation component. Siloed action versus collaborations. Linked to the first point, siloed action meaning you as a company acting alone without consulting your stakeholders. Stakeholders, I mean internal stakeholders as well as external stakeholders. External stakeholders can be your suppliers, can be your clients, can be your government agencies, regulators, media, NGOs, etc. Right? So earlier on in the earlier panel, we talked about social aspects. So I think a lot of things like social aspects, I think the external stakeholders need to be consulted as well. That's why the collaboration cannot be forgotten from this siloed action. What do we really mean by climate risk and opportunities, right? So this is in a slide, one glance at the so-called equation. Of course, non-exhaustive. A lot of us would know about your transition risk, your physical risk, and actually nature and biodiversity risk is actually gaining momentum these days. And we all know nature, of course, in Indonesia, in Southeast Asia especially, is a very important topic. We have a very rich and important ecosystem of nature and biodiversity in this region. And of course, there are overlaps between physical risk as well as nature and biodiversity. I think because of the time limitation of this session, I will not go much, or I will not go into nature and biodiversity, but rather more on transition risk and physical risk aspects, right? So let's talk about climate-related risks first, right? And this table, again, a non-exhaustive list of climate-related risks, telling us how each category actually leads on to things that can transmit ultimately into the traditional categories of risk, right? Let me start on the right-hand side this time round, right? Of course, you see that all these categories actually lead in one way or another. Thank you. Yeah. So all these risks actually leads back to your traditional risk categories through your things like CAPEX, OPEX, revenue impact, and of course, in terms of reputation, it actually potentially has an impact on how steady would the company continue to get capital from investors, right? The different categories of risk, some are self-explanatory, some are not so straightforward. Physical risk, I would say, pretty straightforward. Policy risk really stemming from the increase in future carbon cost, carbon price that might be imposed on companies, hence, developing a carbon tax mechanism along the way. I think we spoke about that in the morning as well. There's supply chain and value chain risk, which come from suppliers and customers, climate risk, which can affect you as a company, whether you are a customer or a supplier in the end, right? So Suppliers also face transition risk, physical risk, right? So don't be surprised. Reputational risk, I think, especially when it comes to asset managers, financial institutions, one of the first reference points a lot of them actually look at is at ESG scores, which S&P Global supplies. And then, of course, it's your press activity, news features, also part of your company's disclosure, how well you've actually disclosed, what is the quality of your disclosures. A lot of times, your investors, your customers would also do peer comparison, right? So if you're in the industry, especially if it is a highly emitting industry, peer comparison is actually very common. Lastly, technological risk, right? Which means what is your risk of suffering stranded assets in future? How well are your technologies or your assets future ready in a sense that they are already pretty energy efficient or low emissions based, right? If within a company you have a lot of high emitting technologies or assets, then a company can be said to be at high technological risk. So one mechanism that we use, market players use to really measure or quantify climate risk is through the use of scenario analysis, right? And of course, that is a requirement by a lot of the disclosure standards out there. But again, just to caveat, disclosure standards are not there to have you stop your journey at just disclosure. They are merely a guidance telling you what might be best practice for you to follow in order to integrate sustainability into your overall business life cycle. Right, so scenario analysis, what is actually what actually is a scenario analysis, right? So the purpose of a scenario analysis is really to portray possible future outcomes that allows us to measure what the company's development or what kind of risk the companies will face in future. Right, it is a matter of fact that nobody today, I'm sure, among the crowd, nobody here actually knows what temperature alignment we will end up with, let's say in 2030, let's say in 2050, let's say in 2100. How much global warming would there be? Is it 1.5? Is it 2.5? Nobody really knows for sure. And it is precisely because nobody knows, that's why we need scenario analysis, because it limits, it provides the assumptions for us to visualize, for us to imagine future possible outcomes, future possible scenarios that the companies may sit in, right? So in this scenario analysis, typically it can provide a quantitative, ideally, or it can provide a qualitative hint or signal of what kind of risk would there be in future, right? And the use cases for such scenario analysis usually, like as mentioned on the slide here. Again, risk management, very obvious. And risk management would then inform the strategy setting once you've identified what are the risks, how do I minimize them. And of course, earlier, as mentioned by our speakers as well, climate risk stress testing is one of them, especially done among the banking industry. Sustainable financing, similarly, because the scenarios will inform the kind of sustainable financing needs down the road. And of course, lastly, and needless to say, reporting and disclosures, just to fill the requirement. So on the slide here, I've actually portrayed two commonly used climate scenarios, right? And again, the climate scenarios serve to portray future outcomes of global warming in, for example, in 2050 or 2100 in future. And in order for these scenario developers to develop these scenarios, they need to come up with certain underlying assumptions. A lot of times, the underlying assumptions has to do with things like, number one, economic development, number two, socio-economic trends, number three, technological trends, number four, government policies, sometimes, the use of energy, the system of energy usage in future, right? So we've got two examples. One is IEA scenario, one is IPCC scenario. Earlier in one of the panels, we also mentioned NGFS as one of the scenarios used, especially within the financial industry. Right, for IEA especially, it focuses really on the trends of future energy usage to come up with these scenarios, right? So you'll see on the left panel that there are three scenarios. One, NZE, APS, STEPS. they all align to different assumed temperature outcomes. Of course, the higher the temperature alignment by 2100, which is the STEPS scenario, we can say that we expect the policies to be more lenient, right? And of course, in the NZE, which represents net zero emissions scenario, we assume that the policy set to disincentivize carbon emission is the strictest. And of course, with strict policies controlling emissions comes greater carbon prices. So sometimes we colloquially call these three scenarios low, moderate, high carbon pricing scenarios. Similarly, in the IPCC context, they have, instead of three, they have five scenarios, right? And the main factors determining IPCC scenario is two factors. One is called shared socio-economic pathway, which looks at things like your economic development, geopolitical aspects, as well as technological development. It is paired then with RCP, which represents representative concentration pathways, which looks at what we call radiative forcing, which causes global warming. That means they have five different scenarios of, again, alignment of temperature, right? From low alignment to high alignment. Of course, the lowest one meaning that the, again, strictest policy and hence highest carbon pricing potential there. So now let's take a look at our S&P Global data. What is the percentage of companies that have completed climate-related scenario analysis, right? This can be your transition risk scenario analysis, can be your physical risk scenario analysis. Well, on a global average, we have 37.4. It's all hovering 30+% in global APAC as well as Southeast Asia. Indonesia has quite a bit of an improvement to meet based on the current sample size of 132. Right now it sits at 18.2%. Right, that means there's potential, there's opportunities for companies to use a scenario analysis method to develop climate risk or climate strategy for the company. Earlier on, we saw about 38% in Indonesia that show evidence of climate strategy. What this shows is that some companies, or actually a lot of companies out there, doesn't or have not really used quantification method or quantified method to derive what might be the future climate risk. Some of them, or some of companies, or a lot of companies actually use a qualitative estimation method, just imagination and desktop research, right? Which is very, I mean, it can be directional, but sometimes the quantification of risk would help to give you a lot more relativity, or give you a lot more information on the degree and severity of risk that companies might face in future. Right, so this is a case study or an example of how we would analyze the policy risk of a company. Policy risk, once again, is about how much risk companies would face in view of increasing carbon pricing in the future. So on the left, it actually uses the example of the IEA scenarios of low, moderate, high prices. And this is actually showing the average carbon price risk premium of the East Asia and Pacific region from 2025 all the way to 2050. Once again, of course, we see that the high scenario actually has a steepest trajectory when it comes to carbon pricing in the future, right? That means, again, strictest policy. And on the right, we actually imagine a case where a company has a base year emission of 50,000 tons CO2e with possible rising emissions in red scenario, constant emission, and decarbonization trajectory. Of course, even if the company were to remain constant in its emissions, the cost rising out of policy risk is still expected to increase over time, from 2025 to 2050. That is because overall carbon pricing is increasing nevertheless. Even if they were to decarbonize at a rate of about 5 to 7%, you see that the downwards curve in the annual risk doesn't really fall by a very sharp gradient. And that is again because carbon prices are expected to increase over time. Before I end the segment on transition risk, I just wanted to show this one slide, which is, I think, something that not a lot of corporates may have familiarized themselves with. And this is in accordance to what we understand financial institutions do. Right? Of course, we know corporates, companies tend to get financing from banks. And banks then, because of the loans and investments, they are exposed to transition risk through the finance emissions that is acquired through the financing activities. Right, so a lot of banks have already started to analyze their finance emissions composition and are already starting to act on it because of the exposure to credit risk, for example, which is discussed earlier as well. Right, so this chart here shows a sectoral breakdown of what kind of carbon emissions lies within a sample portfolio. And when a bank looks at it from this angle, this is before looking into measuring the climate risk, right? This is just looking at emission and intensity. Right, the thing that comes to financial institution mind is that they want to, one is, of course, benchmark against what their peers are practicing, and of course, optimize their carbon intensity, right? And some companies or some banks are already starting to set sectoral targets, especially for those sectors that are high emitters, right? Things sectors like power generation, airlines, cement manufacturing, and things like that. Right, and even more progressive banks are already starting to actively engage, actively manage their borrowers or investors to decarbonize over time. Develop strategies alongside them so that they have an action plan that would then improve the overall carbon performance of their portfolio in future. Now I go on to physical risk, and this is research done by S&P Global Sustainable1 back in 2023, basically concluding that extreme heat and water stress are going to be the key physical risk levers that lead to economic losses globally, right? In the 2050 SSP 3-7.0 scenario, one of the IPCC scenario. This is in the absence of adaptation measures, right? So if we look at East Asia and Pacific, which we sit in currently, the same applies, right? So the greatest exposure is to extreme heat, future extreme heat relative to the past, right? As well as water stress. And then, of course, there's a certain exposure to fluvial flood, which is river flooding, pluvial flood, which is rainfall flooding, wildfire, and storms. Right, of course, I mentioned earlier, companies should not think of sustainability as a siloed action. Value chain and supply chain is very important. This chart shows the value chain physical risk exposure, and the more rightwards the sectors are, the more exposed to value chain physical risk they are, right? So you can see sectors such as automotives, chemicals, agribusiness, consumer, forest, paper products, building materials at the top right quadrant of this chart, right? The conclusion is that, again, overall, every sector would have certain degree of value chain physical risk exposure anyway, right? And sectors that are more prone to this impact, right, would be those that are heavily reliant on your upstream sectors, right? So for example, if you're a downstream company, you have many layers of suppliers, right? All the way from your farmers, for example, and transport and distribution, for example, right? So when climate change happens in a very heavy manner and affect their business, you as a downstream player would definitely, indirectly be impacted by physical risk. So that is something, again, to pay attention to. And a lot of companies that we engage with are asking us, okay, how do we measure or engage suppliers? How do we start to measure supplier physical risk? That is something we provide as well, which is not too different from how we compare a company level physical risk anyway. Right, again, so this chart again tries to crystallize for you what a physical risk impact looks like, right? So on the left chart, you see, a very uneven exposure to different kinds of physical risk hazards, right? So you got your wildfire, extreme heat, water stress, blah, blah, blah. And of course, depending on where the asset is located, depending on the asset type actually, the impact, the financial impact arising from physical risk would actually be different from different climate hazards. On the right, I attempt to explain how we quantify financial impact from physical risk, right? So there are certain factors that are very important in order to deduce the conditions to measure physical risk, right? So things like your asset location, needless to say, different locations on Earth has a different exposure to climate hazards. Climate hazard related, so which climate hazard are you actually assessing? Is it your water stress? Is it your extreme heat? That is important. The asset type is important and very important because different asset types have different relationships and interactions with different climate hazards. So for example, if you are a manufacturing plant, the chances are you may not be as hardly damaged by, say, pluvial flood, rainfall flood, than you were for water stress, because manufacturing, especially hardware manufacturing, is quite dependent on water as a resource or as an ecosystem service to supply its operations, right? So just think about it in that way, different interactions with different climate hazards. And then after that, we would develop a impact function, which is sort of like a transmission channel, which would lead to sensible financial pathways and ultimately lead us to the change in financial impact that is affecting the company. Right, on the rightmost column, you would see an example, right? So imagine we are looking at a coastal area and we are assessing coastal flood risk for a company. And this asset type we are looking at is really a urban high-rise asset, sorry for the typo. Right, the impact functions, or rather the damages, would be arising from things like cleanup costs, because coastal flood would damage or flood into the asset, causing certain cleanup to be required. Repair costs, because it would damage the assets. Rental income costs, because there will be a downtime in terms of rental for the asset. Foundational damage in very bad cases where the flood actually damages the foundation of the asset. What would this mean? It would have increased expenses, operating or capex. It would lead to decreased revenue because of the rental income loss. And then it would have an impairment on the asset because of the foundational damage. And ultimately, that translates to a reduced net income and reduced book value of the asset. So that is, in a nutshell, a simplistic way of looking at how financial impact arises from physical risk, right? And as I mentioned earlier, the more common physical risk aspects are like extreme heat, water stress. There are flood risks as well. So in terms of the impact pathways that I just mentioned, right, we would be looking at factors such as employee productivity, cooling costs, business interruptions, cleanup costs, water expenses, employee health. All these would then ultimately lead to a change in revenue or operating expenditure for the company. Of course, that leads us to the question of how we address these risks. And I think some of these risks can be partially offset by adaptation measures. So one example is when we look at extreme heat. A lot of times the more basic adaptation measures will be your green roofs or your cool roofs that is supposed to offset some of the temperature damage to the asset. For flooding, then some of the more straightforward, of course, non-exhaustive, some of the main straightforward ways of adaptation would be things like your dry or wet flood proofing of the asset. Of course, when you talk about adaptation, it has to be cost effective in order to make it work. Imagine a case where your adaptation measures outsize damage overall, then it doesn't make a business sense for any investments to be made in adaptations, right? So in order for this business model to work, if it were to benefit solution providers in adaptation, then ideally the cost to implementing adaptation and maintaining adaptation needs to be lower or much lower than the anticipated financial impact brought about by physical risk. And according to a recent S&P Global Sustainable1 and GIC Singapore's research, we actually projected that the total demand globally in 2050 for selected adaptation solutions, such as your green roof, your cool roofs, your wet and dry flood proofing, could hit annually $29 billion by 2050, right? So that is the kind of market that is available in a projected way in future. So with this topic, it brings us to the question of climate opportunities. Right, earlier on I talked about risk, now I'm talking about opportunities, right? Sorry. Yes. And there's actually many ways to look at climate opportunities. But what we have in the market, what we have as a guidance, once again from a standard setter like TCFD, is that they've provided 5 categories of climate-related opportunities, right? So things like resource efficiency, which looks at, again, self-explanatory, optimizing how resources are used. This can include energy, materials, water, waste management, and things like that. Energy source, again, pretty self-explanatory, shifting energy usage towards low-emission sources. Products and services, markets, they look at generating new revenue streams in the long run, in the medium run, by developing low-emission products and services and entering markets or entering investments to leverage transition to lower carbon economy. And lastly, we have resilience, right, which is about developing adaptive capacity to respond to climate risks and capture opportunities that allows for more steady control of risk and opportunities in future. So when we again speak to companies, a lot of times we get asked, how do we actually get started with identifying opportunities? And there's no right or wrong answer to it as long as it gets done ultimately. Right? Some companies prefer to go by a desktop research manner. Some companies may be a bit more careful in the sense that they like to do a thorough assessment with a professional, for example. One of a very interesting conversation I had with a bank recently is about how sustainability is not really the precursor of their conversation when they speak to the SME clients to look for sustainability solutions. Right? A lot of times, and a lot of companies, a lot of us here in the room may already be doing or pursuing climate-related opportunities, right? Just that we do not really know it. It's because, for example, the conversation I have with the client, with the bank, is that they start their conversation with the client actually looking for efficient solution. It does not mention climate efficient. It looks for efficient solutions in the sense that they may be looking for energy efficient solutions. But they don't say that I'm looking for sustainable solutions, right? So that is something that sometimes companies are already doing, but just that we don't know it. For our approach, illustrated on the slide here, actually, we choose to be a bit more guided in the sense that sometimes when we work with clients, we really set the target. The client understands the trajectory needed to reduce the risk and capture opportunities, and thereafter, that informs them of certain pathways they can then pursue. Is it electrification? Is it pursuing renewable energies? Is it about investing in digital twin? A more quantitative approach on the left bottom corner is about water savings that can be derived, again, through scenario analysis for a company. And on the right panel here, basically, is to showcase a recent project that we've done with a client, a mining company, tapping onto the clean energy technology trends that provides new markets, new products and services they can move into subsequently. right? So again, compared to global and regional averages, Indonesia has also quite a bit to grow in terms of identifying financial opportunities related to climate. I know I'm quite out of time. I will skip this slide in the interest of time. But I think all in all, my job here is done in a sense that my topic was managing climate risk and opportunities, why it matters. In this slide, I've broken it down word by word on why it matters. Right? And managing is about identifying, integrating sustainability strategies, optimization, monitoring, and making changes iteratively. Climate risks are factors that can expose business to financial impact. Opportunities, factors that can minimize risk or capture value for the business. Why? Is because potentially it prepares the business for an uncertain future in an unknown temperature alignment in an unknown year in future through scenarios. Why it matters? Because it can have far-reaching effects and financial outcomes on businesses, value chains, as well as, of course, on the impact materiality side. It can also have impact on society, environment, and the economy overall. Right, so with that, thank you everyone. Terima kasih.